Good morning, everyone, and welcome back. My name is Paula Tama. I am the single market and industry correspondent at Politico Europe. Welcome to our panel discussion on how the EU industrial strategy can go hand in hand with the European Green Deal. Just a couple of housekeeping remarks. We have an app for this event called the Politico Events app. Once you open it, you can go into the item program and click on the relevant session. This one is panel discussion on the EU industrial strategy and the EU Green Deal. And then click on the tab video feed. And that will allow you to submit questions to us that I can pick up and then put to our speakers. You can also tweet about this event with our hashtag Politico Competition. We have also launched a poll presented by Cefic, which you can reply to. The following question. To achieve the EU Green Deal objective of climate neutrality, the priority action for the EU should be to make full use of climate diplomacy to ensure we're not the only ones going down this path, to level the playing field by adopting a carbon border adjustment mechanism at the EU's borders, to allow greater public investment into strategic sectors needed for the green transitions, such as, for instance, offshore wind, hydrogen, batteries, and so on, and to the supporting infrastructure, and to improve consumer acceptance and willingness to pay. So let's begin. I am joined online by Mauro Petriccione, Director General of DG Clima at the European Commission. Welcome, Mauro. And by Pete Harrison, who is Policy Director, at the European Climate Foundation here in Brussels. Welcome both. With me at the studio, I'm joined by Marco Manisk, who is Director General of Cefic, the body representing the EU's chemical industry. Welcome, everyone, and many thanks for joining us. I would like to get right into it with a question that I would like to put to all. So in the wake of this crisis, we have heard renewed calls to endorse and pursue our environmental objectives. But at the same time, investors' confidence is very low. Governments have bailed out their national industry without a second thought about environmental purposes and largely without imposing green conditions, because the first priority is to save jobs and companies to avoid unemployment in the long term. On the upside, though, there's never been this much public money available to governments to invest in their economies. So to kick off the discussion, I'd like to ask to all of you, and Mauro, you'll go first, is the Green Deal being slowed down or sped up by the coronavirus epidemic?
Thank you, Paola, and thank you to Politico for this invitation. Look, you said that governments have bailed out our industry. They haven't yet. At the moment, all the member states have done, and the Commission and the European Union have supported them, is to provide emergency aid, liquidity support to keep companies able to pay salaries and to pay their creditors and avoid that the whole thing would collapse. Now, the money on the table is the proposal of the Commission for repair, recovery, and reconstruction of our economy. And that money is very clearly aimed at reconstructing a greener economy and a more digital economy. The Green Deal and the digital agenda will be at the heart of how that money is spent. Now, we're not there yet. We have a Commission proposal. It's an unprecedented proposal. But now it has to be endorsed by member states and eventually by the parliament. So I think we haven't bailed out industry for free. We have prevented a collapse collectively, and I think reasonably effectively in the circumstances. The question is, will member states approve what the Commission has proposed in anything resembling its current form? But that includes very clearly the Green Deal and the digital agenda. These are not conditions which are going to be added on at a later stage.
We'll get back to the clarity of the conditionality to access the EU's recovery funds. But first, I'd like the other speakers to give me their views on the first question. So, is the Green Deal at greater risk or a greater rate of success because of the coronavirus epidemic? Pete, we can go with you.
Okay, thank you. So we see this as a make or break moment in the transition to a zero carbon economy. For the European economy to recover, we have to invest in assets that lead to job creation and are future-proofed for the path to zero emissions by 2050. And the Green Deal is the blueprint for that. However, the Next Generation EU proposal doesn't do that. We're pleased with the high-level positive wording on the Green Deal and the priority that's given to climate change mitigation. But we're concerned about the detail. The current proposal could mean that Europe ends up spending large sums that will have to be repaid by future generations on assets that will end up as stranded. Spending at least 25% of the budget on climate measures is a good start, but it's insufficient. We'd like to see 40%. And that should be combined with a clear do no harm principle that prevents harmful investments such as fossil fuels. Let me give you just a couple of precise examples of where things fall short. In the Solvency Instrument proposal, it's stated that commissions, quote, shall be encouraged to put in place in the future green transition plans. That is too vague. Companies benefiting from bailout support must commit to putting net zero transition plans in place. In the Resilience and Recovery Facility, with a proposed budget of 560 billion euros, climate conditionalities are optional. Climate neutrality needs to be a mandatory principle in the resilient recovery plans to be submitted by member states by October. And we need a clear governance process around their evaluation. And thirdly, InvestEU only excludes solid fossil fuels. But I think we all agree that future-proofing implies that all fossil fuels should be excluded. So, to summarize, there should be no scaling down of climate conditionality in the recovery package proposal. A 40% climate action mainstreaming target should be set for the entire EU budget after 2020. And all fossil fuel investment must be included from all EU funding instruments, be it Next Generation EU or MFF. If we ignore these principles, we'll saddle the next generation with stranded assets, intolerable levels of debt, and a climate emergency that cannot be fixed. If we follow the principles that I've outlined, I'm confident we'll future-proof our economy, our jobs, and our planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Pete. I'm sure Mauro will come back to you on some of those points. But first, perhaps let's hear from Marco on his view of what's happening from an industry point of view. Are we more willing to engage with the challenges posed by the Green Deal, or do you see a threat?
Thanks, and thanks to the other two speakers as well for their introduction. I think there's opportunity. I think there's also a timing issue which we carefully need to look at. But I need to explain that by saying a few words on how the chemical industry went through the crisis. In the beginning, it was all about supplying important chemistry to Italy. We then focused on the disinfectant production, and you've seen that ramped up around Europe. We had huge issues with the green lanes, but all in all, the chemical industry was quite resilient. And if you look at results we're now starting to see, the first quarter with the tail of the crisis was still quite good. The second quarter was really rough. And now we face a situation which I think we should pay attention to, which is that demand is not yet coming back. So if you see where industry right now is, we face a lack of cash, we face a lack of demand, which needs to come back, and it's slowly coming, which will lead us for sure to a debate on a V or a U-shaped. But if you then see what the chemical industry needs, and I think that's where it comes together with the Green Deal, a renovation wave in Europe will create the demand, not only for chemicals, also for steel and cement, and you can clearly combine it with the Green Deal. Restart of automotive, extremely important for us as well. A new setup on chemical recycling and an integration of circular economy and low carbon economy. All now we come to the point where indeed this massive fund can make a difference and where I think our interest will align. The one reason to mention the timing is large-scale investments right now when companies are cost-cutting and reorganizing. I think you will see that be pushed into 2021, which gives us a bit of time to prepare. So main message is opportunity, but be aware of where we are currently in 2020. The time, I think, gives us the momentum for the heads of state to agree on the budget, set the priorities, and then indeed focus to get the renovation wave, a large supply of renewable electricity for the industry, the hydrogen infrastructure, maybe that's the word as well, infrastructure, which is a clear need to integrate, for example, steel, cement, and chemical sectors. Thanks.
Thank you, Marco. Well, I'd like to pick up on the points made by Pete, because as the Commission presented its recovery plan and all of the various instruments within that, we were looking through to check for this green conditionality. And indeed, in some of the instruments, the wording appears to be vague. In particular, in the recovery facility, under the recovery facility, to access the resources, states will have to draft national recovery plans, which will then need to be agreed on by Brussels and by a majority of their peers. However, pursuing the Green Deal objectives, and chief among them climate neutrality by 2050, seems to be listed as one of the tick boxes, so an option among others, notably the digital transition. So, Mauro, you said that the money on the table for the recovery is going to clearly be linked to the European Green Deal. Do you think that in the assessment of national recovery plans, that is going to be a sine qua non condition, or there will be some adjustments based on more urgent and pressing needs, such as unemployment and social unrest and so on?
Thank you. Well, first of all, let me refer to what Pete said. I don't think we have any disagreement on the direction in which we want to go. Now, let's look at the instruments. This is a proposal. Proposal can always be improved, but it's not a proposal that comes out of the blue and it's an island in a deserted ocean. This is part of a policy framework. That policy framework includes a firm political commitment by the European Council towards climate neutrality. It includes the fact that we have a massive amount of mandatory legislation in force for at least 40% reduction of GHG emissions by 2030. We will come up in September with an impact assessment and a legislative plan to increase that target to 50 or 55%. We have a climate law on the table which makes the climate neutrality objective mandatory for the European Union. And the lively debate among member states is about how far this should go, but nobody's contesting that objective. We will come up with a strategy for hydrogen, a strategy for energy system integration, a strategy for renovation wave. So you put all this context around the recovery plan. Member states have produced national energy and climate plans. They don't go far enough. The Commission has criticized them. The Commission will criticize them again. But we are building the machinery for the member states to actually do what it takes to achieve these targets. Now, you can always say, as long as we don't see you doing it, we don't believe that you will impose green conditionality in the approval of the National Recovery Plan. Fine. What do you want me to say? Wait and see. I think this Commission has been putting its money where its mouth is consistently, and we will not have national recovery plans that aren't green. Now, is that the only objective on the planet? Have we forgotten that our long-term strategy has a subtitle, climate neutral, but competitive, modern economy, a prosperous society? Are we saying that we should put green objective in contradiction with our social objectives? Are we saying that no industry is a good option for a green industry? So at the end of the day, why are you surprised that there are other objectives in this recovery plan? There are other objectives in life than making Europe climate neutral, but they don't come at the expense of making Europe climate neutral. On the contrary, we all know that our competitiveness internationally isn't a disaster that many people say, but it's fragile. We need to modernize. We need to become more energy efficient, more efficient, more productive. We need technology leap. This is the occasion to speed up. Until a few months ago, we knew where we had to go. And the question is, do we have the investment capacity for that? Do public powers have the firepower to prompt more private investment. Well, now we do. And as the president says, we do because we're going to borrow from the next generation. I think we know perfectly well what the next generation wants. They want jobs, and they want clean jobs, and they want a clean environment. So if we're going to borrow from them, as the president said, the least we can do is to spend that money in that direction. So, okay, if it's a matter of trust, all I can say is wait and see. I think we do have all the instruments we have, and many of them are mandatory, to ensure that the recovery is going to be green. If member states do agree to that kind of financial firepower, which is not done yet.
That is a big question for this month, indeed. You prevented my next question, which was about if the EU will present an updated climate target for 2030, what will be its impact on competitiveness? We heard from you that you have a positive view of this, that it doesn't come at the expenses of European competitors, but indeed it could be a green niche which the EU place itself in. However, my next question would be, are others keen to follow in our path? So the US has initiated proceedings to pull out of the Climate Paris Agreement. There has been voices toward that end also in Brazil, and Australia is keen on its goal. There is a camp of resistance to increasing climate action. China, on the other hand, has invested more than the rest of the world combined into renewable energy and technologies, but at the same time keeps investing and exporting coal plants. So my question for you, at the beginning of the German presidency, which we knew wanted to put the accent on the EU-China relation, including on its climate aspect, will China, one of the world's top polluters, budge? Mauro, for
Talking
you.
to me again?
Yes, sorry,
Well,
you're on the
look,
spotlight.
you and I have no problem. You have, I'm sure you've listened to the president, to our two presidents' press conference after the China summit last week. So you know that we put very clear objectives in front of China. Will China accept to peak its emissions in the next few years? We said around 2025. Will China stop, at least as part of a global initiative, because China is not the only one, to stop financing coal-fired power at home and abroad? Will China endorse climate neutrality? We don't expect China to do it by 2050, but we would expect China to do it as soon as possible in the second half, and we have proposed 2060. 2060 can be discussed, but soon in the second half of the century, something the Chinese economy can do and the Chinese leadership ought to commit to. So we are putting our partners in front of their responsibilities. Will they accept them? Well, in many of them, there is a debate. There was a debate in this continent too, and some of it isn't finished. I don't want to be overconfident. All I'm saying is that you cannot take a snapshot and make reliable prediction of what will happen afterwards. There is a debate in China on climate neutrality. It is not yet solved in the direction we'd like the Chinese to solve it. We will do our very best to encourage them, to support them, and to push them in the right direction. I happen to know that the German presidency is entirely in agreement with this line. We're in close contact with them, so I expect it will be more push. If you look at the United States, yes, we all know what the Trump administration thinks of climate change. We also have states representing half the US GDP actually taking serious commitments towards something resembling climate neutrality, and we have pioneers like California fighting this in courts. So, no, the world isn't where it ought to be. Is it going in the right direction? Possibly. But the last point I would like to make on this is that the main point why you don't yet have a widespread acceptance of the objectives that we are giving ourselves is the same reason why we had a debate among ourselves. Will it work Will it take prosperity away from people? Will it prevent developing countries from developing? I think our responsibility, if we want to exercise leadership in this field, is not just to say the right things and try to persuade others that we are right, is to demonstrate on the ground that you can have a climate neutral, competitive, modern economy and a prosperous society. If we don't do that, our own citizens will reject it. If we do that, we will be an unstoppable example. Are we close to being there? Well, there's a lot of work. There's a lot of work. There are 3 decades of hard work in front of us. But I don't think you need to wait 3 decades to see whether we are succeeding or not.
Thanks, Mauro. I would like to turn now to the question of what if. So these are the requests that we've made to our partners to follow in our path to achieve climate neutrality. But at the same time, from Europe, from European industry in particular, there are requests to guard ourselves and not to be naive, a mantra that the Commission seems to have been taken on. And Europe is becoming, to some extent, more defensive. There's been a lot of talk on the need of reassuring parts of our industry. The Commission just weeks ago presented a white paper on foreign subsidies meant to discourage state support of foreign companies. And the Commission is working on a carbon border adjustment mechanism. So, Mr. Menisk, you are a very export-driven sector. I would like to ask you, how normative can the EU be with the rest of the world, and what are the risks of retaliation?
If you allow me, I'd also like to feed back a bit to Mauro, and then I'll answer your question as well, because Mauro mentioned fragile. I think it's a word which shows what we need to manage is the different speeds across the world. We do see American companies or Chinese companies also moving towards more circularity and having climate targets on their own. So I'm not the expert on the bilateral negotiations between the EU and China, but signal on the wall, the Chinese were the first to translate the CEFIC mid-century vision into Chinese, and we're explaining that to the industry there as well. Now, managing those speeds is going to be complicated, but you need to add 2 dimensions. One is, especially to the heads of state, please get this recovery package going as soon as you can, because that's what we do see in China and do see in India, that they're strongly moving forward on their industrial policy. The second one is make it in such a way that the trillions we're going to spend actually end up back in European industry, and we don't outsource the recovery and the transformation to the Chinese. Because the Chinese understand one thing, which is the market, and if they see the opportunity, they will come here also with low carbon products, as we've seen, by the way, in the way wind and solar have developed. And there's a warning sign. We have now the last chemical company in Europe making chemicals for solar panels, providing the Chinese market. Also there, we see the Chinese increase their production, and we're losing market share. So a strong request is make sure that the funds we're now all putting in actually end up in the benefit of European industry. Now, on the carbon border and retaliation, I think the risk of retaliation is very high. We have a second challenge, chemicals exports to a large extent. I think we have a 46 billion trade surplus. So we're the ones exporting to the rest of the world. If retaliation takes place, we're hurt there. And we somehow need a mirror between import and export measures. The most complex issue is the carbon border measures. We actually don't have the answer or a unified position with the members yet, because it's going to be extremely hard to find the one chemical that only punishes the opposition. So we're studying it. I know the Commission is studying it. But for exporting sectors, you have an extra dimension, which indeed is the retaliation. And that risk is real, especially in the heated trade debates we have right now.
On that note, we won't get bogged down into the details of a carbon border adjustment mechanism because it is a highly complex issue, both practically and legally. But I would like to ask Mauro, and then perhaps to Pete also. Mauro, you've been the Director General of DG Trade as well, negotiating some of Europe's free trade agreements. In this climate of trade tensions, do you see a risk that such unilateral levy on imports for environmental purposes, and assuming that we pass the legality test with the WTO, could actually result into increasing tensions in the trade wars?
The world of trade is full of tensions. It's never been as smooth as the theoreticians of free trade tell us. The question is, if we do our job properly, if we have an instrument which respects our WTO obligation, I have little doubt that we can solve those tensions. I would also draw your attention to the fact that we've never said that we will have this unilateral instrument, this big stick, and we're going to whack on the head everybody who doesn't do as we say. We said very clearly that we will open, and we are opening a dialogue with all our partners on what are they doing to decarbonize their economy. And in the meantime, we continue to prepare ourselves to be able to defend ourselves from the imbalance that the fact that we act and others don't act is bound to create. This is not again, a one-way street. And there are many other countries who are doing serious things about decarbonization and who are shouldering the burden as well as we are. Are they doing enough? Well, let's talk about it. So the picture is it's a bit more complicated than that. And you should also bear in mind that there is a new atmosphere in Europe which has nothing to do only with carbon content. But generally speaking, we have been very open. We continue to be an open economy. When we say that Europe shouldn't be naive, when we talk about resilience, we are looking at the fact that perhaps there are some imbalances in our relations on trade with other countries, and we need to find a way to correct them. Dialogue and negotiation and cooperation remains the number one priority of the European Union. It doesn't always work. And when it doesn't work, we'll have to do something to protect our border. Don't forget that we have effectively contained the risk of carbon leakage through the free allowances mechanism of the emission trading system. Again, I'm not saying that it's perfect. There have been some examples of carbon leakage, but by and large, it's been contained and been very manageable. Now we're going to have another hard look at this emission trading system. It will need to be strengthened. Is this mechanism good enough? Perhaps not. Hence the debate on a border adjustment mechanism. And if I can say a word about the point that Marco made, as I said earlier, we will continue to be careful about the interests of our industry. We want to keep economic activities and jobs in Europe. So I don't think there is any disagreement. The reaction we've seen from the European industry to the crisis has been reassuring. There's been little pressure for a return to business as usual. There is a lot more interest in saying, let's seize the opportunity to kickstart and to jump ahead on the transformation that we know is necessary. So things are going reasonably well, but we want more. Many industries in Europe are taking commitments. We're happy about that. We will be asking them for more commitments, for clearer commitments, and the governments will have to do their part. But we will be asking a lot more of the European economy in terms of going green and at the same time becoming more competitive.
Thank you. I'd like to pick on one of the audience questions because it raises a point which is also part of what I wanted to discuss about the cost argument, right? Because one of the arguments used by sectors of the industry to against increased climate targets and decarbonization is cost competitiveness. And a question put by Bruno Herry, who is Director of Government Relations and Head of the EU office at Lionel Basel, who I believe is one of SAFEX members, asks to Pete Harrison in particular. It's a long question, so I'll pick one point out of it. How does the chemical industry in particular can be expected to achieve 2050 climate neutrality when this technically does not exist yet, while maintaining competitiveness and therefore investment capability? So it is also a technical challenge for many of these sectors to achieve this objective. I know that ECF has done a lot of work sectorally to look at how to decarbonize sector by sector. What can you tell us about petrochemicals in particular? Another viewer actually says that the petrochemical sector is a large emitter. What is the vision of how to reach zero emissions, and how is this sector covered in the EU industry strategy? So your perspective on this, please.
Okay, very good. We've done quite a bit of work at the ECF. We've funded quite a bit of work looking at different pathways to reach a net zero economy, and to do so within energy-intensive industries, so particularly steel, cement, chemicals. And what we found is that there are multiple pathways to get there. And depending to some extent on different technology evolutions. So there are pathways that would maximize the use of CCS for heavy industry. There are pathways that would maximize the use of hydrogen to replace coal, for example. And there are pathways that would maximize circularity. I would definitely say, there is much that is already known about the pathway. Of course, we need to do more to explore those technologies and the policies needed to support those pathways. Nonetheless, we're in a position to get started. And what we found out in this process is that the cost for the end consumer is relatively small. We're talking about 1 or 2% on a plastic bottle made from zero carbon materials, or a few percent on a building constructed from low carbon cement, or likewise for steel in a car. So the problem is not with the end user. The problem is with the intermediaries. The secondary materials can be increase in cost by between 20% and over 100% in some cases. So this really brings to light the issue of competitiveness. We need to take the competitiveness issue very seriously. But this really starts to become a genuine issue when the carbon prices start to rise to the necessary levels for reaching net zero. In doing so, we shouldn't double up the safeguards. So if we introduce a border adjustment, we would need to stop allocating free allowances. But as Mauro said, the developing a border adjustment in Europe requires collaboration, both leadership and cooperation with our trading partners. Unilateral moves can be misinterpreted and lead to retaliation. Everyone remembers the events surrounding including aviation in the ETS. But if done well, good diplomacy, good collaboration could help move other countries in the right direction. And this policy discussion could actually increase climate ambition globally. But I think, the thing we should be thinking about is what is the policy design that gets us there? Because today, the major risk is not carbon leakage. The major risk for heavy industry is investment leakage. And that's partly due to policy uncertainty. These are extremely long-lived assets. By 2030, around half of European blast furnaces for steel will have reached the end of their lives. More than half of the steam crackers for chemicals production will be gone by then. So there has been decades of underinvestment. And unless we get the signals right, the investment and the innovation will migrate elsewhere, and with it the jobs. So the worst thing is that solid policy makers can send the wrong signals, and companies end up investing in assets that ultimately become stranded. So just a few words on what is the right approach. I think we all recognise that the ETS in its current form is insufficient to deliver those emissions reductions. The Commission and industry and civil society need to work together to explore the policy combination that will achieve that. In our view, from the work we've done so far, contracts for difference, public procurement are important parts of that puzzle. And over time, gradually tightening product standards could play a key role. And I was taken by the Lord Barker's mention of making Europe a low carbon, the low carbon workshop of the world. And I think that's what we need to focus on. But that means bold policy at the EU level and at national level. It doesn't need timid policy. And we've seen in recent years how timid EU policy led to massive investment in diesel, which is about to become a stranded asset. And so if you look, bold policy out of California led to the creation of Tesla, right, which is now a global champion and a global, the most valuable car company. And likewise, China is moving boldly ahead with its policy to support electrification. And so that would be my message, is we need bold policy in order to create that low carbon workshop. Thank you.
Thanks. Sorry, I'm just aware of the time ticking. I'll give you a very quick comeback to that because I saw you nodding, which is rare sometimes to have an industry representative and part of the environmentalist community to nod in agreement. But I want you to answer one specific point which Pete made, which is no double up of protection. This has also been a point made by Mauro and the Commission of you cannot have free allowances and a carbon border tax because that will not be the right signal both to the rest of the world and to European industry. So what is your position on that? And then if you want to come back on some of the other points Pete made, quickly, please. Thanks.
I think Pete just proved himself. We do need a double up. And actually, on the contrary, one of the strange moves the Commission now seems to make is to withdraw the compensation on the indirect ETS according to drafts also for part of our sector. Why saying that? It's indeed about investment leakage. Second point to raise, the reduction is not linear. If you go back to the old roadmaps, and ECF was there at the time with Connie Hedegaard, you saw that industry will go down, and then at some stage, breakthrough technology will take the major steps down. Breakthrough is out there by the 2030s. So the puzzle to square is how to keep industry running until those technologies are available, make sure those technologies are actually built and invested in Europe, but don't drain the industry of the funds needed in between. And why do I say you should double up? A simple explanation. The industry operating in Europe will have the higher cost. The industry supplying Europe with parts of its production on the European market will only have that cost on that production, not in general, which means the cost level of those companies outside Europe will not be impacted as the ones inside of Europe. So I think that's too black and white discussion, which says if you get the one, you can't get the other. I think you need to get both in a mix that stimulates the development of the new technologies and keeps the industry running. Now, one point there in addition, and please remember that linearity there as well. We've said we support the Green Deal and Europe going climate neutral by 2050. You heard Mauro say as well, a lot is happening in industry. I think it is good. The Green Deal gives us the opportunity now to all work together to get those breakthroughs in 2030 available in Europe. That's pretty exciting moment we're in. Meanwhile, we need to make sure that we make it with our investments here and that actually people would want to invest those technologies in Europe. We had 2 companies to announce the first climate neutral petrochemical site in the world in India. We had technologies in steel, which also then upscaling went to India. And that's what we need to avoid. And therefore, I think the protection needs to go hand in hand with the support for the innovation. So Pete and I are neighbors. Actually, from our building, we look at the building of the European Climate Foundation. I think we'll dialogue a bit more across the street on that one.
That's great. Well, Brussels is indeed a small bubble. I would like to put one final question tomorrow, because I know that the Commission next week is preparing to adopt the EU's hydrogen strategy, following a German one. which happened last month. And this is supposed to provide one of the missing links to achieve climate neutrality, because producing clean hydrogen should allow to clean up and decarbonize some industrial processes which currently have no alternative. I'm thinking of cement and some petrochemicals. But I'd like to ask you, and picking up on a question also that was asked by one of the viewers, why does Europe still have high state aid regulation for public investments in fields of green transformation? The German strategy includes so-called contract for difference. So it's the willingness of the state to provide a part of the investment cost and back up private investment that way. Is Europe willing to provide different rules for investment in state aid, for public investments in sectors needed for the green transition?
Okay. First thing I would say is that next time I appear on one of these panels, I would ask the ECF to write my briefing, because I subscribe 100% with what Pete said in his last intervention. And then where you see the convergence, including on the question you've asked, Paola. Investment in the next 10 years is the fundamental. That was the problem we had identified, and that was the issue in which we were scratching our heads 6 months ago. It is the Green Deal is also a good deal economically. Can we afford the upfront investment? Business probably can afford it. What is the incentive for them to do it? And can public powers play their role? That was the set of questions, fundamental question we had in front of us. Now, if member states follow the approach that the Commission has proposed, yes, it's borrowed money, but it is normal to borrow money to invest now if you have a reasonable certainty that you will recover that money and you will have a better situation later on. So I think we are at a very crucial moment. If we are capable of putting together the public investment required, which prompts then the necessary private investment, and manage the transition over the next 10 years, I'm not saying in 2030 we'll be on a roll, but I think we will be having a very, very different conversation than what we're having now. Now, in that respect, yes, the instruments have to be adapted. You will see the hydrogen strategy. You will see what we propose in terms of what we think public powers ought to explore in order to support the emergence of not only of a hydrogen market, not only the production of hydrogen, but also the end uses of hydrogen down to end products. And those end products can be as diverse as chemicals, steel, and many others, and automotive. You will also see at the same time an energy system integration strategy. How does hydrogen function together with electricity, together with natural gas and its transitional role in the climate transition? You will see this Friday the first call for proposal under the Innovation Fund. And these are the technologies that we want to support with that. So please do not concentrate on one instrument. The Union is a complicated entity, but it also has a very complex and very articulated set of instruments, and you need to package them together. So public support for new markets, for clean products, there will have to be. The question is, how do you build that public support in a way that makes products competitive over as short a time as possible, rather than creating white elephants that cannot survive without public support? Because with that, we will soon run out of money, no matter how much we borrow in the international markets. If we do what we've done with renewables, that were expensive, but worked, renewables now are becoming a competitive source of energy. So that was well-spent public money, and that's the example we should follow.
Thank you, Mauro. I'm aware we're over time. I'll just quickly give you the results of the poll, which is very on point, because according to 70% of the people who participated, to achieve the EU's Green Deal objective, the greater single action that the EU could do is to allow greater public investment into strategic sectors and the supporting infrastructure. So the audience seems to be pushing you in that direction as well. I'd like to thank all of our panelists online and physically. So I was enlightened for a discussion that touched upon the importance of keeping within our commitments of the Green Deal, while actually looking at and taking a hard look at how to make that possible in certain key sectors. There are a lot of discussions on how exactly this should be done and what are the instruments it plays, whether it be that review of the ETS, carbon border adjustment mechanism, increased state aid, and in what form. But overall, I think that the direction of travel is set, and we will work out the details. So thank you so much. I would also like to thank our presenting partners, CEFIC and EN Plus Group, for making this event possible, as well as our knowledge partner, McKinsey. And this was the last session of our morning, so I would encourage you during the lunch break to reach out to other attendees using our political events app, and you can have virtual conversations if you allow yourself to be a virtual participant in your app profile. All right, we will reconvene at 1:50 p.m. for a panel discussion on Europe's investment and the future of Europe's industry and SMEs. Thank you.